Welcome to Old Path and our Monday studies through the Old Testament, currently in the book of Ecclesiastes. We're going to get to the third chapter today. We'll start it and get through a portion of it. We won't complete the chapter today. But before we get to it, a couple of things real quick. As we conclude today, I want to do kind of an update on the things that are taking place between Israel and Iran. It's the Monday after the initial volleys back and forth, first Monday after all that's taken place. And so some very significant things have taken place, and there's much news that's even breaking today. So not only is it important as far as our understanding, biblically speaking, and I know that there are probably plenty of questions as to our trip that we're taking to Israel in October, and I'll be able to address that as part of the update of what we're looking at. But the long and the short of it, depending on what the news is, that things are being reported today, this very, very easily could be something that is ratcheted down tremendously. And I'll get into that as we conclude the study. So when it comes to the trip that we're taking there, I would expect that come October, things are back to normal. What Israel has been able to do to Iran is absolutely beyond what most people are aware of. And so the ability for the belligerents of Iran towards Israel, we already know what they've done to their proxies with Hamas and Hezbollah, and now this time they went after really the head of the snake, if you will. And so we'll talk about that and how it might relate to our trip there in October at the close of the program. If there's anything that I deal with, I'll put this out there now. If there's anything that I deal with in any of the studies that we do, whether they're the shorts or the apologetics that we do at the end or the actual study itself, you can always contact me through the ministry's website, which is oldpaththeology.net. And that's also where you can get information from me if you want to send me an email about the trip to Israel in October, and you would like to ask any questions about it. The trip is filling up, and hopefully what's going on there will not really concern people to the point where they would want to think about not going. If things are like they are right now, of course, travel doesn't go there, so it's not a big deal. But as far as making a decision, I should say, it is a very big deal as far as the things on the ground. But as far as us going there, if it's a danger, of course, we don't go. But anyhow, anything that you would like in the way of correspondence, then please contact me through there, and I'd love to be able to talk to you about any of it. So the book of Ecclesiastes. Let's go ahead and turn there, and we'll go ahead and pray first, and then we'll just make some observations, because there's a bit of a transition here from chapters 1 and 2 into chapter 3. So let's have a word of prayer, and let's go ahead and take a look at the text. Father, we thank you for the time that we can spend in your word, and we're grateful for the things that we read, and then we can make application to them. So we pray that you would help us in our understanding of what was said by Solomon at the time, and what it would look like to the world as he would say them, and in the world in which he lived and was the king. And then how do we make application to our here and now world? We pray, God, that you would give us wisdom and understanding in these matters. So we thank you, we give you all praise, and we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, and so even in the things that I just said in prayer there, it is a very important thing to remember that when we're reading something like the book of Ecclesiastes, remember we're reading it from Solomon's perspective, and I have no doubt that it's Solomon that's writing this. But Solomon would be basically looking through at the world through the eyes of a king of the nation of Israel and a man who is under the law of God, the Mosaic law, the law that was given through Moses. So the things that he would be saying, remember, his audience would be much more limited than we might think of it today. When we pick up the Bible, anybody on the planet, for the most part, unless you live in one of the crazy places that don't allow people to own Bibles, but for the most part, all of humanity is able to get their hands on or some way the Bible is available to them. And they would read Ecclesiastes, and if they don't really understand it, they wouldn't know that Solomon's audience is considerably more limited than what we have currently to us today. So as he would say these things initially, he would be speaking more to the nation. Now, of course, God had other intentions, that it's going to go beyond that. But people in the church, like us today, as we read these things, we don't look at what's being written here in Ecclesiastes and as something that we would say it's a theological work, and we need to really pay close attention to the things that he is saying, because it's thus says the Lord, and we should believe these things, and then doctrinally we should act accordingly. What we have right here currently in front of us, as Solomon says these things, he's really kind of coming at the end of chapter 1 and 2, where he said, I was going to make it my aim to find out, these things about folly and madness and wisdom and all this. He's going to make a kind of a work of his life to understand these things. What is it that makes man tick ultimately? What is it that's the pursuit of things? What is life all about? A number of ways you could try to explain it. And so he goes to try to put it to the test. A man of, as I've said before, unlimited resource. And as far as the mental and the intelligence capacity that he would have, again, he's not rivaled as far as man is concerned, if we take what God says very seriously. So he's put those things to the test, and he's frustrated at the end of it. None of his pursuits has answered whatever those questions are, to whatever extent they were, in his mind. He just sees it as all futility, and all of his labor to try to figure this stuff out really doesn't account for anything. And he's talked also about, what's it going to be like? All this that I've labored for, everything that I've put my mind to, is going to be left to someone else. And we looked a little bit at Rehoboam, his son, who took over in his place. And everything that he would have had a concern for, Rehoboam is pretty much the poster child for all of what he would worry about. Somebody who would take all the work that had been at the hands of Solomon and really turn it into nothing, to make a waste of it, which is ultimately what Rehoboam did. And so much so that it really split the nation. After Solomon was gone, the nation was left to Rehoboam, and because of decisions that he made, really the whole empire, if you will, or the whole nation of Israel was divided into two parts. So Rehoboam was only able to oversee the southern parts. The northern parts were wiped out. And so shortly after, within 100 years after Jeroboam took over in the north, and went immediately into idolatry. So everything that Solomon, in the hypothetical, in his own mind, could have worried about, those things became the problem. So what we have in front of us, chapter 3, this will be a test to see how old you are. But I got to be honest with you, it's now stuck in my mind. And I don't know if you're one of those kind of people that once you hear a song, for whatever reason, this happens to me more times than I wish. And it usually happens because I'm in a store somewhere and a song comes on that I absolutely despise, but then it gets stuck in your head for 2 or 3 days and you can't get it out. If you're one of those kind of people, you know what I'm talking about. In this case, this song has been ringing in my head for days because I knew we were coming up to it. So Ecclesiastes chapter 3 is really what gave rise to a song that was actually came out on the radio less than a month after I was born. So coming up on 60 years ago, though it was written, it's kind of a folk song that was written back in the late 50s. But there was a band known as the Byrds in the 60s, and they recorded this song based upon much of what we see in the book of Ecclesiastes. So the words themselves, for the most part, are taken directly from this. And then, of course, there's a lot of other poetic stuff that they put in there. And so, you can read the whole backstory on it. What was it gave rise to it? This was during the anti-war kind of things that were going on at the time. And so there's a whole lot to it. You can see as the song itself develops that it's kind of written in a way of just, it really explained a lot about the culture in the mid-60s. So that tells you the whole thing. But when you read through this, you can't help but hear the song playing in the back of your mind as you're reading the passage. So if you know what I'm talking about, you know the song, you'll understand it. And if me mentioning it means that song is stuck in your mind, and I didn't have to go listen to it, all I had to do was read it, and that song starts playing in my mind. So it's probably happening to you as I say it now. And if it hasn't happened to you yet, but it is now, you can throw stuff at me later or write me an angry email about now that song is stuck in my head. But back to the text. What Solomon does here is he moves more to a philosophical point of view. It's just like reflecting back on everything, this is the observations that he gets. So he's so far been kind of telling you about the things that he did and trying to figure it out, and he's at that point now, and it was a little bit towards the latter part of last chapter, but into this one for sure. Here's the takeaway from everything that he found. It's like, let me share with you the things that kind of what I concluded from all of my observations and all of my looking into trying to figure out why these things are as they are. So this is what he's doing at this point as we look through it. So when we read these things, and remember again, we're not reading a theological thing. It's not thus says the Lord. There's a time and a purpose for everything under heaven. It's not the Lord saying this. This is Solomon's observation. So we would want to look at this and say, as we go to the part of this of making the application, after we've read through the things that he has to say, and we've studied the text and understood what it had to say, at the end of it, do we say, as we look at it and we try to make application to our life, is there something that's worth understanding here? And the answer is absolutely yes. It doesn't have to be a thus says the Lord for it to have tremendous value. And ultimately, he probably, or I should say we do, the older that we get, we kind of come to these same kinds of conclusions. And I got to be honest with you, as I get older in life, I start to become a little bit more like this, because there's not as much things that are new as they would have been 40 years ago. When I'm a 20-year-old guy, there's a whole lot more life ahead of me and a lot more things that I have yet to see. Now, the older that I get, there's more that I have seen and the less that I would think that there is to look forward to. Nobody ever comes to the end of learning, but as far as things of life, you've seen a lot more at the end of 60 years than you did at the end of 20. So I kind of get that little bit of the futility of things, and you just wonder, when does the cycle break? To the believer here and now, we obviously know the answer to that, and we have great comfort in that, knowing that whether it's here and now, if we end up leaving this earth, whether it's by our own death or the Lord comes back for us, we know what comes next, and there's really no uncertainty with the whole thing, and it gives us a great deal of comfort in anticipation of it. There's no fear of it if we start to think of it like that. But when we look at the things that Solomon would be talking about here, if we were having the conversation with him, we might ask things, then do you see everything as kind of in a chaotic sense? Or does there seem to be some kind of order to it? Does it mean that as we read these things, that this is something that is not just life, but ultimately God's the author of it? And we have the answer in the internals of the actual passage. But if you just look at it purely philosophic and don't have any more of his words, when you just read everything that you see basically from verses 2 to 8, it's just the extremes of cycles. And in the extremes of cycles, you would say, so is there an order to it? Is there actually, as he says, is there really a time and a purpose for everything? Is that really what's being said here? Or is it just chaotic and things are going to happen on their own and there's really nothing you can do about it? Which kind of looks a bit like the things that he may have said earlier. In this case, he seems to be looking at it much more in the orderly sense. It's not chaotic. So is everything really then ultimately, you would say, is it really, at that point, is it really ultimately according to some kind of grand plan? And so I think we should basically be able to break off between two things here. Is every last little bit and every detail of every moment of every day and every action and everything else, is it all part of some grand plan? Or is it just the larger things, the big monumental things that really God ultimately is working these things out to his glory? So I was kind of thinking about it in my own mind. It's like if I walk around the corner and I cut it a little bit too short and I hit my toe on the corner of the cabinet or the door opening or whatever else, you would say, well, is that a time for every purpose? Like, is that among those things? And we would say, no, it's just kind of neutral. Those things happen. I stubbed my toe. God didn't make it happen. The devil didn't make it happen. It just happened. It's part of being in this creation. But the big things, do they serve a greater purpose? And so is it part of what God is doing, even though we live in a corrupt, broken creation, yet we know that it's working from that place of corruption to a place of perfection? That we know. God's already made that promise to us. So that's in between here and there. Let's face it, we're looking at really kind of the history of mankind when we start to ask and answer these kind of questions. God creates everything as we see it in the world, and we know when it had its beginning. Now, to the believer, the Christian that actually believes literally in what Genesis has to say, we believe that the creation is in the thousands of years ago, roughly 1,000 years ago. And if that's the case, and if that's how we believe what we read in the text there, then we realize that's kind of when the timeline began. The fall of mankind really is when it kind of becomes an issue, because then sin enters in, death enters in, corruption enters in, and everything changes from that point on. But everything from that moment of man, in the people of Adam and Eve, coming into that place of sin and brokenness and spiritual death, is moving us into a place where God will culminate and bring everything to a close, and then usher in something that is brand new. Now, if you've been with us in the New Testament studies, we just concluded the book of Revelation, which gives us an insane amount of detail about that very topic. So the believer lives every day with that as the expectation and the anticipation. Whether they spend a lot of time thinking about it at any one particular time, it still is what we look at, and that's the next thing. We will be gathered to him, and then begins the process. He will, there's the judgment of the heavens and the earth and those that are dwelling upon it. There is the kingdom that he establishes for 1,000 years, and at the end of it, we're in the forever kingdom, the new heaven, the new earth. It's not just a recycling of what was. It's absolutely brand new. It's never been seen before. So we don't look at the things that are being described here as Solomon's talking about it as being somehow arbitrary. These things all have a mechanism behind it. There's a design to everything that we see, even in the midst of the chaos of things. And he's looking at this. Some of these things are actually chaotic. Some of them are just the mundane things that happen during the course of life. These are just things that take place. Others can have a lot of chaos that are kind of wrapped up in them. So it's really important for us to understand the distinctions that he gives here. So what he puts in front of us is the extremes. There is this and there is that, and they're kind of at the polar opposite ends. And he gives a series of them that are there. But the first thing that he says in verse 1 is kind of more observational. And he says this: now to everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under heaven. So the purpose or under heaven is a common phrase that he's been using in this, and that's just the day-to-day of the life of mankind. So from his own observation, what it's like for his time under the sun, all mankind, it's that time under the sun. So when he mentions season and then time, it's like, think of season as we consider them as the four seasons. There's summer, spring, summer, winter, and fall. That's not the... I should say it the way it is. There's winter, there is spring, there is summer, and then there is fall. And so if we look at it like that, any of those would be your seasons. So you would figure, to make it as easy to understand what he's trying to get here philosophically, is to say there's a season, there's a time that begins and it runs its course. And in that time, there are these things that take place. So I might look at it like this. Summer starts on such a particular day and it ends on a particular day. That's my season. And the purpose that happens, those things that are part of God's plan that happen during that time. We're now in our 5th summer here in living in Texas, and I remember the first couple of years were during COVID. And our summer times were spent out at the pool. There wasn't a lot of getting out because everything was so chaotic. And so the things, the events that were different year over year are just the things that happened during that season of time. So if we think about our lifetime as just a series of seasons, this is what's going on at the particular time, and the purpose are the things that happen during that course of time. So in that course, that's where he starts to say, during the season, in this case, the life of the person, there are these events that take place during that season. So in everything, there is a season and there is a purpose for everything in man's existence. And so, again, it's a very philosophical argument that he's making here. And so as he starts to say this, we can look through it and go, I understand this entirely. Now, he's very, very general in the things that he says. He doesn't give any particulars. And so it's really kind of left to the person who would be reading it, not only in their time, but in ours, to just go, I understand the extremes there. And that's when we get to the point of application in our own life. What would it be like during our sojourn here on earth, walking with the Lord, when these times come up. And some of them seem very distant from us when we read about them. It's like, how do I do those things? And how does it kind of work? One thing that I do want to remember, and it's probably good for you to look it up, it's found in James chapter 4, verse 13 is where it begins. And it really does help us to understand that there are those times that God designs and kind of designates that he's going to do a particular work at a particular time. And things that take place that man really doesn't have a great deal of control over, though they can plan. And James deals with that starting at verse 13 of chapter 4, where he talks about the people who would presumptuously say, we're going to do this, we're going to move, we're going to buy, we're going to sell, we're going to live in that city for a particular amount of time, and then we're going to do this and that. They've got it all planned out. And that would run kind of contrary to what Solomon is saying here, and Paul, I think, would agree with him, that there are these things that take place, but it's not as though we're in control of them. These things take place at the seasons of our life, but we're really not the ones that are in control ultimately of those things. Those things are really the purview of God alone, and it is for us to seek him out during those times and stay on the course that he lays out for us. So James would tell you, you got all your plans, but your life's a vapor. You're here for a while and then you're gone. So it's good to make plans, but just realize that your plans are not something that God has to work around. You work around what God's plans are. So his point is, you guys may plan on living someplace for a year and then going on to the next place. You don't even know if you'll make it a year. You don't even know if you'll make it to tomorrow. So it's that better understanding. It's better to ask, what is God's will that we do in these times, during this season, if you will, and the things that happen during it. So in all of these, as we study them, you can see that there would be a tremendous amount of wisdom for the person that would say, at this time, when these purposes are laying out, these things that are happening during this time in my life, how do I seek out the Lord that I would understand in these extremes? What is it that I should do? So here's what we'll do. Let's read, we've already read verse 1, but to everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under heaven. So we get that. The season is whatever it is that's going on at that time, and then these things that happen during that interval, and he gives a number of them here. He says, there's a time to be born, there's a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to pluck what has been planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to gain and a time to lose, and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. So when we read that, we can think, none of it really is deep in the theological sense. There's a couple of things here that we really want to look at what the words actually mean so that we fully understand them. But when we read through most of that, we go, that's just the day-to-day of life. So we can probably look at our own lives in some of these and we can go, I remember at a particular episode of my life when this was true and that was true. We could see the difference between the two when it started one way and then it ended up another, because it was that beginning and the ending of a particular time during that season in our lives. So there are times that you hear people use it so flippantly that I think sometimes it might lose its understanding. But we might think, in the easiest of senses, now we're grandparents, right? My wife and I are grandparents, not all of you. But there was a time when our daughter was very, very young. That season in our life of her being not only an infant or even into a toddler, a young girl, those were all seasons that happened. And a series of events that happened in her life when she was 10 would have been different than when she was 1. Her experiences, our interaction with her, all that stuff is so much different. So there's the time now that my wife and I are getting in our older years. We're not doing the same 9-to-5 grind that we used to. Our lives have changed quite a bit. And the things that are of interest to us and of importance, they've changed a bit. So we get that. We understand the philosophical part that Solomon's really kind of dwelling on here. And it's good for us to, kind of take that all in and really genuinely understand where he's coming from. So as he says all of these things, it's just for us to step back and say, how does this actually work in our experience as far as our lives are concerned as we understand these things? So the first one that we look at, verse 2, is it says there's a time to be born and a time to die. So of course, this is probably, though this is as much of a as you can get in the life of any person. There's the beginning and the end of it. most of these other things can be something that happens just over a short amount of time. But the life and death is the whole of man's existence, any particular individual. The other things would be what fits kind of in that time. So there's a time to be born, there's a time to die. Nobody gets out of that. It's just the way that it is. There will be that one generation that the Lord comes and receives to himself. And, I believe that that could very easily be mine, but I also realize I've been believing that as long as I've been a believer, from when I was basically 20 years old. And again, now I'm almost 60. I still believe it as much as I've ever believed it, but I don't want to run out of years. I'd love to be a part of that. Although the other alternative is, I'll see the Lord regardless. I see him face to face. That's the promise. So there's the comfort in that. So there's a time to be born and there's a time to die. There's a time to plant, and then there is a time to pluck what has been planted. So in that, again, from beginning at your birth to your death, there will be those times, thinking in the agricultural sense, and it can go beyond that. You can use planting as a metaphor, the things that you will put into the ground, if you will, whether literally or figuratively, but then there's a time to collect them up. But if we think in the most obvious terms here, that's kind of a seasonal thing. There are things that you would plant, and there's a time that you would harvest what's being planted. So again, the idea of planting, and then there's a time of harvesting what had been planted. And then it says here, there's a time to kill, and there's a time to heal. As a king of Israel, there would be kind of the thought of war. And so that time that war would kind of come and go, that's much more in the thought here. So when we see this, we get it and we go, yeah, in the application side of it, we can only see it kind of from afar. Unless, of course, you're a person who serves in the military, and if you do, thank you for your service, or if you have. But then again, there's that time that we send off people to war. And right now they're in the midst of a horrible one in the Middle East. But that won't always be that way. There's a time that people will heal up. And it doesn't mean necessarily that you're healing up your opponent. It means that you yourself are healing up. So there'll be a time that you go out to war, but there's a time that you come back from that and you begin the process of healing of those things. Now, some people might look at this and say, well, the idea of war and healing can be something in the emotional or the spiritual sense or anything else. And I guess you can make the application, and it's okay, but I don't think that's really kind of what he's got intended here. But again, if it turns out that it's dealing with the personal kind of things, we get that. There's those times that you're going to get into a place where there is real tension between you and someone else, but then there's a time to let that go and heal it. We're starting to read into the text at that point, making the principle is pretty straightforward, though. If again you're a king and your nation has gone to war, that's not going to always be the case. There will be a time when you can begin to heal up. So there is a time to break down, and there's a time to build up. Once again, in the idea of a nation, there is that time that you begin to put the things back, or you put things together, but then there's also a time to take it down. And very broad in the way that we look at it. And yet when you think about it here, that gives the feeling of a much more temporary kind of an existence. So, if you think, well, what does he have in mind? It's very hard to say, again, because these are very, very general descriptions. This is, of course, what you would find as they would move through the wilderness, when that time from leaving Egypt until God brought them into the land, when the tabernacle would be built up and then torn down and then taken to the next place. It was always being moved. But this gives that idea of sojourning and moving from place to place, but not having something so permanent. So there's a time when you put everything together, and there's a time when you also take it down, and it's just done in the sense of a process. It happens in a repetitious kind of a way. He says, now there is a time to weep and there is a time to laugh, which is, doesn't need an awful lot of explanation. There's those times when things are taking place that cause great mirth and happiness and joy and laughter, and other times where there is times of great grief and of mourning and of weeping. And of course, we think about that when we think about the life and death. So is it it's the sense of loss that causes a weeping. Now, if there's that idea of loss and weeping, we start to think of it as people and people that we love, and when they come and go and move on. So again, we understand it, very, very general, a time to weep and a time to laugh. There's a time to mourn, and then there's a time to dance. And these things are very closely related, obviously and clearly. So weeping and laughter, and then mourning and dancing, there's if we're thinking in the sense of life, those all kind of make a great deal of sense. But here's the thing that's really kind of cool about this, and this is something that we can find as we study throughout the scripture. There are things that we're going to read and we take away from the text that we're reading it. How do we make application to what it is that we've just read? And without Solomon going into any kind of great detail, the application can be something that we can say, well, here's how that might apply, here's how we may have experienced it in our own life, and it's not really something that we can say, that's not really what he's getting at, it's more along these lines. If we can get at least the main part of it, we can start to say, well, here's how that's kind of played out in my life. So when you look at those things that are there, weeping and laughing, mourning and dancing, to mourn or to dance, you think funerals and you think weddings, right? That's kind of what you're thinking. Mourning and laughter, the joy of life versus the agony and the weeping that comes around from death, or relationships, or whatever it may be. So it's intended not for anybody to go, what's the hidden meaning behind this? Solomon is deliberately using the most general of terms so as to make it very broad in its application. Because remember, what he's doing here, he's not trying to teach you something. These are his philosophical, kind of more observational things as he sees. He looks at the entirety of life, and remember, he's wanting to figure out why it is. Remember, he's talking about generational things. One group comes in and they die and they're remembered no more. Whether they're rich or poor, they're here for a while and then that's the end of it. There's nothing left at the end. So we get the idea of him looking at this almost in the sense of the futility of things, but at the same time, during the life of all believers, there are those things that are really good and those things that are really bad. And the interaction of good and bad events, the effect that it has on the people is very real. And this is kind of what he's pointing out to us here. So he says this, now there is a time to cast away stones, and there is a time to gather stones. Now, there are a lot of ways that this is looked at, and it's when you start to look for hidden meanings that I think you can kind of get into problems with this and taking it beyond what's being said here. Usually the most broad sense of something that's said here is more than likely the way that he's looking at this. The idea of gathering, or in the sense of casting away stones. This makes the most sense when it's thought of the idea of building. And so if there's a time when you're building something that belongs to you, remember, this is the nation of Israel. There was allotments of their land, things that they would build for themselves, and then there would be the need to either build or to tear down. So what would be a reason for somebody building a house and then tearing it down, but then probably only to rebuild it? If a family expands, it goes from just a husband and wife to a husband and wife and children. Do you try to expand the dwelling? Well, if you're going to be the dwellings like we're thinking of at those times, just of the normal, person that lives there, the idea of stones and the idea of borders and making sure that you're lining out what belongs to you, fences, those kind of things. There's a time when you just go, it's time for us to do that, and it's no longer necessary. So during that season of life, whatever that may be, in that season of life, you're like, we're going to build, or we're going to take apart what has been built for whatever reason. Repurposing it, it's not necessary anymore. But again, it just shows that Solomon has in mind that kind of the ebb and flow of life. The things that were of real importance to myself and my wife 20, 30, 40 years ago. 40 years ago, we were kicking around, or we were getting involved. Let me think. 40 years ago, we knew each other. We weren't yet dating. We're still a few months away from when we first started dating. But let's say 30 years ago. Our priorities and the things that we were concerned about 30 years ago, considerably different than what they are now. So the things that we used to do in the way of building, if you will, our lives as we have them in the 21st century looks different than what it would have been, 3,000 years ago. But still, nonetheless, the priorities of a younger couple are different from the priorities of an older one. So that's kind of, again, when you start to think of it in those terms, in the philosophical sense, you can see how some of these things work. So he says this, now there's a time to embrace, and there's a time to refrain from embracing. And so some would see this as like friendships. This should never happen within married couples. So it's not the idea of, well, I want to go give them a hug. That's not what we're talking about. The embracing here is much more in the sense of belonging to, and the idea of people that you have embraced and held close to you. Some even look at this and saying, well, there's a time, because if it's going in with the weeping and mourning and all that kind of stuff, you will have those people close to you and you will embrace them, but there's a time when you have to let them go because they're moving on from this life. And again, as far as kids are concerned, that's kind of one of those things too. Your little ones are held close to you, but the day comes when they are out on their own, and that leaving or that releasing of the embrace doesn't mean that you're no longer in love with your kids, but they're somewhere else and they're doing their own thing. So there's a few different ways that you can apply this without reading into the text. You would just want to be able to say, when do you embrace someone and when do you let them go? If it's friendships, there's usually a reason why you will allow your release of that embrace. But when it's family and things like that, if you're moving away and you're not going to see them any longer, you can't embrace them in the same way. You may do it from a distance, you may still love them and care about them, but still there's a change in the relationship, and that's more what he's getting at here. So then in verse 6, it says, now there's a time to gain and there's a time to lose, and the gaining is acquiring. So you may be in a time of your life when there are so many things that you have held to yourself and you've acquired them, but it doesn't mean that you're going to hold on to them forever. And the other one is kind of along the lines of it, because there's a time to keep and there's a time to throw away or to release it. You don't need it anymore. And so right now, again, is a great example of this. We have my garage is filled with stuff that we're going to be using or taking to a garage sale in about a month. Things that we've acquired over time, and so many of them have to do with my grandsons, because they're over at our house all the time, and there are those things that we have gotten for them over the years that they have outgrown. And so do we just put it in the attic and keep it when it'll never be touched again? We're not going to have any more grandkids. Do we just hold it to ourselves when it's something that they don't have anything to do with? But rather instead, it's time for those things that we have acquired. It's time for them to be let go of. We've held them to ourselves. They were useful for that time, that purpose under heaven, but that's gone on. Now, as I say these things, it helps you to realize that the very temporary things in life, nothing remains as it has always been. And so good for us to remember that we are to keep a very loose grip on this life and on this world. Hopefully we're catching that from his words here. If not, it's good for us to kind of plug in on that. And really, that we don't need Solomon to tell us that. We should know that from the things that we read in the New Testament. Our grip on this world should be very, very loosely held, because this world does not belong to us. We don't belong to this world. If we read what Jesus has to say in John 17, he says, he is not of this world, therefore we are not of this world. We are here for a time, Paul would reason with us, and he says, but then we are gone. So our time here is limited on this earth. Solomon strikes at that quite well here. But if I could be honest with you guys, when I read this and start to reason through the stuff that's here and make application in my own life, again, I'm not only sympathetic to the things that he says, but there's a little bit of melancholy that kind of comes into my life. And if you know what I mean by that, melancholy is like, you look back on it, you just realize there's so much that has happened over the years and so much that I would love to go back and relive, but I can't. That's time that's gone by and I don't get it back. But when I read these kind of things, you can get melancholy looking back and, gosh, I wish that I had it to do all over again. So you can look back in retrospect. And again, I don't look back at life with any regrets. Looking back on life, I'm grateful for what God has given. Very, very grateful. I'm grateful that I live in this country, that I have the freedom to do the things that I do, as bad as things have become and the fault that we have as far as nations and the idea of the encroachment of secular and evil things. Still, nonetheless, I don't have any regret for my almost 60 years on this planet. It's been a wonderful, wonderful time, and God has blessed greatly. But I do read through these things, like the idea of the things that were so when we first got them, or when my grandkids first laid eyes on these things and they were so important to them. They were so excited by what they got. Now they're just sitting in a corner and they're collecting dust, and they're going to become somebody else's possession soon. So that there's a time to acquire things and then there's a time to let them go. just kind of gets, it hits you right here, right? So now, how many of you guys are tearing up as you hear this? You know who you are. So in verse 7, it says, now there's a time to tear and there's a time to sow. There's a time to keep silence, and then there's a time to speak. The first part of this, the idea of tearing and sowing. Remember, we read it a lot in the passages about when people, usually it's when some very calamitous thing takes place and there's some terrible event that happens, or if somebody has died, and you would see the people that they say they rend their garments, they tear their garments. And it's not that they do it indiscriminately, like they tear it and it's never coming back. It's kind of torn almost with a deliberate way of doing it, because you have the intention. Clothes were not as easy to come by. They were a lot more valuable than what we have today. And by value, I don't mean monetary. It's just like, you don't just run through it, because you're not going to just run down to the store and buy a new shirt if you get damage to it or tear or stain. You mend your things. So whatever it is that you're wearing, if you're tearing it, you don't plan on just tearing it and leaving it somewhere. The time's going to come when your mourning and your grief, your outward grief that's shown, it's going to be sewn up so that it's still usable to you. There was a value to things. So there's a time for you to have that grief, that outward expression, the tearing of your garments. But then there's a time when that passes and you're going to mend that garment. There's an importance of it. Now, the second part of it, where he says there's a time to keep silence and then there's a time to speak. And really interesting that whether that's what James was thinking when he said it in chapter 1 of his book, James chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, he has a similar thing where he just says that we should be quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to anger. So there's a time when you should be taking things in. It doesn't need for you to comment on it. It's better to just be the one who listens. And the keeping of silence doesn't mean that you're just ignorant of what's being said. It doesn't mean that you tune it out, that you don't have any interest in it. You can listen intently, saying not a word, but you're hanging on every single word of it, but it doesn't need your contribution. It's taking in all of the available information, the facts that are being laid out. So before you go from that place of silence to where you start to speak on those matters, there's a time that's appropriate for both. Now, human nature to not always necessarily see the line between those things. So what Solomon says here is worthy of understanding and worthy of acceptance, and it's correct and it's good. Doesn't mean that we do it. So when you read that passage in James, it says, because it's be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger, because the wrath of man, or acting on that anger, will never bring about the righteousness of God. So here, Solomon is kind of along those same lines. There's a time when it's appropriate to just sit and listen. Another time where it's appropriate to answer. But even in the answering, doesn't mean necessarily that what you're answering is correct. That you're breaking your silence or you're going to speak doesn't mean that what you're saying is of value. Basically, the outcome is going to determine which one is which, right? So the idea of tearing and then sowing, that time of just outward grief, and then the time of the beginning of healing up, very much the same as what we read a few verses earlier. And then the idea of silence versus speaking. Then there's a time to love, and then there is a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. And a time for war and peace is very easy for us to understand. That's very, very general in its understanding. And we would see, as we're going to conclude today, when we start to look at what's happening in the Middle East, there is a time for those things, but it hopefully is not a perpetual kind of a thing. So war and peace, we'll get to that and make it a part of what we're looking at in our passage, or in our discussion of Israel afterwards. But there's something that's really interesting in these last two, because when we look at it from a New Testament sense of things, the idea of hatred. What things do we find in our life as a believer that you can say we can hate it? There's something that we can hate, and God's not going to have a problem with that kind of hatred. So we would never want to say that hatred towards a person on an individual level is someplace that the Bible, especially for the New Testament believer, would ever condone. Jesus tells us to love your enemies. You don't hate them, you're to love them. So there are plenty of other places in the New Testament where we would realize the idea of hating an individual for something is something that we cannot do. So if we're going to go ahead and look at this, again, time to love, time to hate, time for war, time for peace. From Solomon's point of view, 3,000 years ago as a king, it's different in a person under the law as opposed to the things that have been said to us, not only from Jesus, but from other writers. And the idea of hatred of something, there are very few things that we could say we have a hatred of that is justifiably held, biblically speaking. So let's look at the first of those. The idea of love, easy. That's not a difficult thing. We can have love for our friends and family. We can have love for our spouses that's much more preferential than it would be for the common person. We're told to have a phileo, a brotherly kind of love for all mankind. We can have a different love for our spouses, entirely different, that's expressed in different ways. But the idea on a personal level, we always think of love in that sense of on the interpersonal level. But we're also told that we are to love God because he first loved us. And so there is that genuine of our, that's reciprocal. God has loved us first, and we love him in return. John talks about that in his epistle in 1 John, that God first loved us. And so his love towards us was perfect and unconditional, and it would sacrifice anything because that's what the demand was. So he has this agape kind of love for us that he expresses towards us, and it's supposed to be returned to him in the same way. Now there's that hatred, and you would say, so who would we have hatred for? And it's not as much for as the things that we would have hatred against. We would hate the work of the devil, we would hate sin, we would hate those kinds of things. So people would say it's okay to hate Satan. Okay, that's fine. You can hate Satan all you want to. I hate the result of him and what he has produced on this earth. I hate sin. I hate the consequence of it. I hate the corruption that it has brought. I hate the death that has ensued from it. I hate what it has done to the lives of people. I hate error. I hate false belief systems that confine people to an eternity separated from God. We can make our lists of things that are worthy of our hatred, that God will not look at us and say, your hatred is misplaced, it's wrong, it's emotional, it's raw, it's whatever. There are those things that we know that are absolutely worthy of our hatred, as much as there are those things that are worthy of our love. The good thing about it is that you'll get some of that. You can look through the writings of the Old Testament. You'll find those things that God says you can love and hate. But to the believer in the New Testament, they are really very understandable to us. We know the difference between those. There's not a person on this planet that I look at and I look at them eye to eye and say, I hate that person. There may be people that on a personal level, I've got very, very strong feelings about them and what they're about. But to say that I have a hatred for them, that's crossing over a line of just saying, I have a real problem with them on a personal level. I don't have desire for fellowship. I should pray for them, but we're never going to be friends. I can do that. But it doesn't step over the bridge that leads to hatred. That's a different matter altogether. So then this idea of war and peace. And remember that war and peace in the most general of sense, we could think of people going out, nations going against nations, and the battling of all that stuff. But remember, there's also there's a spiritual aspect that I want to make sure that we are very, very aware of as well. Because when it says that there's enmity between God and man, that means that there is hostility between man and God. And a person who has not come to him for forgiveness of sin is in that place of enmity. It is that war that goes on between God and man. Now, the idea that there is peace between God and man, there's one person who has made that peace for us, and it's Jesus. He's the propitiation. He's the one who has made peace between us and God. And let's remember that God, our lack of hostilities between us and God is not because he's accepted our terms. We have accepted his, if that's genuinely the case. So if there is peace between God and myself, it's because he says, I offer you peace, but here are my terms to that. And it's important that we understand what that means, and that we really fully grasp that, because it really is the difference between the believer and the non-believer. That a person from the beginning of their lives, from the time that they can even understand it, that God has a standard and he calls us to that standard, there's either the acceptance of that or there is the rebellion against it. And that's the difference between war and peace. Mankind, because of sin, is at war with God. God says, I can get beyond your sin if you will look to me for forgiveness, but it's on my terms. And then there can be a ceasing of this war and we can move on to peace. So Jesus has made peace between us and the Father if we've accepted those terms and look at him as our peacemaker who has brought us to that relationship with God, that we are no longer enemies. We don't war against him in a war that we could not win. So there is that really, I mean, Solomon couldn't have even been in his wildest dreams, even assuming that we could look at this 3,000 years down the road and go, oh, Solomon, if you really knew what the cessation from war really looks like in the spiritual sense, through the eyes of a believer and what Jesus offers to us as the forgiveness of sin, it is nothing short of absolutely amazing, and the promise that's been given to us in that. So really, really interesting things that he puts out here in the series of, like, you know, the extremes of either side of it and seeing what it looks like through those eyes. So really, really fascinating study that's going on here as we start to move more in the philosophical side of things and moving away from the original, let's just call it, for the lack of a better description, the experiment of what he observed and how he wanted to try to prove things to his own heart and mind, and the paces that he went through to try to come to some answers, only to come to the place of saying, I couldn't figure any of it out. It was just all frustration to me. But beginning with this, there's some really, really cool things in this that if we start to say on the application side of it, once we understand his wording, it becomes really, really interesting as we work our way through it. So we're going to be picking up then at verse 9 next week, and we'll probably will be able to complete out the chapter as we move through this. So Israel right now and the conflict that's going on. Interesting, we just finished with war and peace there in the text, but currently we're in this place of war in the Middle East, and what all does it mean and what does it portend for things going forward? Now, if you've been watching with any interest, I'm sure you have been over the weekend, you know that there have been volleys gone back and forth, and it's really been fought differently in that Israel has air superiority. They're able to go in and out of there with their jets and do the things that they're doing. They're not having to do like Iran, where they're launching ballistic missiles and they're just, everything is being sent by air. They're not doing it with aircraft in the same way. The interesting thing about this, is Israel's calculation to do these things, and everything that they looked to do was to do as much damage as they could in the initial wave of all of their command and control, by going after generals, by going after nuclear sites, military sites. That's the whole thing that they have done from the beginning, was to go after surgically those things that really created the problems for them. Now, the idea that in these last 4 years, because so much changed with our administration here, Iran had the ability to build an awful lot more stuff, but still, nonetheless, their stockpiles of missiles and ballistic ones that can get all the way to Israel had been growing for all of these months. And so money was able to come into the country. They were able to get billions through normal means of selling product, mainly oil. But then there were also other ways that they had received a lot of largesse from our country. You know, we don't need to go into all the details of it, but because of that, they were flush with a lot of cash and they built up stockpiles. As far as Israel is concerned, their calculation, really everything began to change because of October of 23. October 7th of 23 changed everything. Without Iran, there is no Hezbollah and there is no Hamas. So October the 7th happens, Israel goes and takes out Hamas. In the beginning of that, ever since the beginning of it, Hezbollah up in Lebanon was sending stuff in. So then Israel turns its direction there when they could, and they go after all the senior leadership there. So if you're part of Hamas or Hezbollah, all of its upper leadership is long since gone. Israel took them out. The question is, what do you do? Because there's still the things that are happening with the Houthis down in Yemen, And really, all of it has its genesis in this one group that we know as Iran and its religious leadership. It's a theocracy that underneath the surface, the people hate the ruling regime that's there. But nonetheless, it is still nonetheless run as a theocracy, and it's Islamic, right? So Israel is at this place of calculation. It's not just the nuclear stuff that they've got, but as they're able to continue the stockpiling, they're now getting their feet underneath them. And so the question would be, if you're Israel, do you strike now while you can, as they're kind of moving more in a direction, not just nuclear, but with everything else that they had going on? So Israel sees their opportunity that's here, and if you're hearing the news over the previous weeks going up to it, there was still the attempt to do some kind of talks and come to some kind of an agreement that Trump was working on. But Israel had gotten to that point where we're done waiting. And Iran was doing its typical thing, trying to buy time and making it impossible. The news that we're reading today is that Iran is looking for people, the governments not only of Saudi Arabia but of Qatar, to work with Trump and not with the Israelis to try to get him to put pressure on Israel to end the conflict. It's one of two things. It really is either genuine, which I kind of doubt. They never seem to be good faith kind of people. They're always looking to buy time. We noticed that with Hamas. Ceasefire this, ceasefire that. We're 2 years in. So the ceasefire is only so they could regroup, and all the rest of it. Is Iran actually trying to buy time? That's kind of more my thought, because there'll probably be a ton of caveats in this. If they can get somebody to come to the table and say, we're willing to talk terms of ceasefire and peace, they're going to make all kinds of demands. And so I don't think that there's really any real genuine desire in this, but clearly that this is the first sign that they have been really horribly hurt. Now, again, we're not going to get all the information up front, but we do know that when Iran was targeting only civilian areas, that's all that they were concerned with. And if anybody says, well, they're just, they're going after military sites, this, that, and the other thing, you don't go after Haifa and you don't go after Tel Aviv unless you're looking to indiscriminately kill anybody that you can. I read an article before we recorded today where Israel is already telling people in places where there are military installations, but also civilians, they're telling people to get out. Of course, Iran, when they're firing those things off, aren't telling people in the shelters in Haifa or in Tel Aviv, we're sending ballistics your way. They don't care. They just indiscriminately want the carnage of it, and any Jew that gets killed in it they're more than happy to have that be the case. Israel's being careful about that being military, and when it started to become civilian on Israel's side is when they started going after infrastructure. We're going to make it where you can't sell your oil. If you're going to continue to go after our people, just by going after apartment buildings and stuff like that, we're going to start to take out your infrastructure and we're going to make you hurt. So that's where we are currently at this point in time. Now, what does that mean for our trip potentially in October? And so one of two things. They're either going to keep trying to play this game like they've been doing with Hamas of saying ceasefire and peace talks and all that stuff, and they're just, keep running the same exact thing. I don't know that Israel's necessarily going to do that. They've been a lot more agreeable to that because there have been hostages. That is not the case in Iraq or in Iran, and it wasn't the case up in Lebanon. So that took a lot less time to go after the heads of Hezbollah, and that's why the North quieted down coming out of Lebanon. As far as Iran is concerned, Israel can continue. They have complete air superiority. When they last October took out their anti-aircraft batteries and all that stuff, and Israel just wiped all that out, Iran starts to try to rebuild that stuff. So, Israel's window could begin to close, not only being able to go back in and do more because they could rebuild those systems, but they weren't asking anybody's permission. They were getting to the place of uranium enrichment that it was unprecedented, that the kind of purity that they were getting out of the uranium. So that's always been the direction that they were going. It was well beyond civilian and energy use. That part they knew. So with all that being said, here we are today. And what does it mean down the road? So again, if really Israel has done the kind of damage that they have done to Iran, and it brings them to the point where they can't even function, you may very well get to the place where the writing's on the wall for the leadership to realize if we don't do something quick, the people are going to rise up against us. That could bring them to the negotiating table, and it could stop Israel from doing what they're doing. The damage that's been done to the infrastructure in Iran is enormous and will take years to even begin to correct, and that's just for the civilian use, let alone their atomic and their other military things. That, who knows if that'll ever get back online. So what's been done in these last few days is nothing short of devastating to the nation of Iran. So again, their stockpiles are what they are, and they're going to run out of them sooner or later. So as far as our trip in October, I would be surprised if any kind of this kind of hostility is even kind of being thought of at that point. I can't see how this doesn't come to a resolution much sooner than that. The rebuilding and everything will be a big deal in Tel Aviv and Haifa and places like that. These aren't places that we go to. We will have one day in Tel Aviv, and if it's undamaged, we'll be going there, but they'll be in the rebuild mode by that time. So I don't expect that that's going to be much of a problem for us as far as the trip is concerned. But the war itself is intriguing, and let me mention one other thing. The people have mentioned when this first started, this is the beginning, this is Ezekiel, it's 38 and 39. And even if you're one who believes that Ezekiel 38 and 39 are one war and they're going to be happening in the near future, if you believe all of those things, it is a land war that comes to Israel. Iran is in no condition for that war to take place, and the coalition of the other nations, nobody has come to Iran's aid so far. The only thing I've seen even remotely close is that they said that there was some stuff coming in from China. What it is and if it even is and all the rest of that stuff, Israel has a good idea because, again, they have air superiority. They know what's taking place in Iran. So if nobody comes to their aid in a major way, there's no way that Iran is able to march an army as part of a much larger coalition to come against Israel all at one time, because everybody's sitting back and kind of watching. And Israel's being able to do as it wills all throughout the nation of Iran. And if you count how many, there have been hundreds and hundreds of ballistic missiles fired towards Israel. It's only a handful that have gotten through, but it shows you the destructive power of even those few that got through. So we mourn the loss of life on both sides. Nobody wants to see a person meet their end because of war. But nonetheless, I think that there is, in Israel's sense, in Israel's life, I guess you could say, a strong and a well-equipped and more dangerous as time goes by Iran is existential as far as their survival is concerned. So the idea that they took these measures makes perfect sense to me, and I don't have any problem with it. I support it entirely. But they didn't need my approval. I didn't get a phone call asking if I was okay with it. But anyway, just want to bring you up to speed. That's just the things that we've seen since the beginning of it and where we are currently in time. So with that, we will conclude for today. We'll be picking up again at verse 9 next week. And if you have any questions on any of these things, then please contact me through the ministry's website, oldpaththeology.net, and we'll pick up next week at verse 9.